Hi everybody, welcome to my studio and welcome to a new video. Today I have something exciting prepared for you. I'm gonna do a full watercolor landscape tutorials and it's one of my most favorite scenes. It's one that is sort of encompassing all of my favorite elements, from mountains to water to greenery and rocks and snow and the sunset, and it's the scene that sort of imaginary, but it has such a realistic sense to it. It's very dreamy, and I love making it not just watercolors. I also painted it in oils, and it comes out just as beautiful. So if you want to follow along with a different medium, feel free. You can also grab gouache if you would like to. And I'm excited to start it. But before we begin, I want to share something else that is also very exciting, is that I recently received a new brush cleaner, and this one is gonna blow your mind. So let's open it. So this brush cleaner by Gamenote is more than just a cleaner. First of all, it's very compact. It's not bulky and it's easy to store and put away, but also it doesn't take that much space on a table. For example, I always use two containers for my water, one for cleaning my brush and one for storing clean water for making all of my color mixes. But this one is now gonna do the job for the two containers, and let me show you how. So at the top, once we open the lid, you can see the two containers for your water inside, and the bigger one that you use for washing your brushes actually has a textured bottom to make sure that you get all of the dirty mixes out of your brushes, and you can lightly scrub it. These are plastic, these are not sharp, so they're not gonna damage your brush. And the container next to it also helps you store your brush effectively, so it's not submerged in the water completely, because if you leave your brush sinking in the water is gonna get into the barrel here, loosening up the glue that's holding all of your bristles together, and eventually you're gonna start losing the brush bristles. They're gonna be coming out as you paint, and that's gonna be destroying your brush. So you can store your brush now nicely secure in these holders, and if you're not using it for the rest of the painting, you can just drop it in one of the holders in here. So this is actually not all. If you remember, we had the lid, so let's just pop the lid open. And this is also an effective paint storage. You can squeeze out your paint into these wells, and because the lid on the top secures tightly over it, your paint is not gonna dry up. But also, this is an effective way to use this as a mixing palette. Both of these lids can be used to mix up your washes. If you're working with acrylics and you need to mix up a large amount of paint for larger areas, or if you're working with watercolors and you want to make sure that you have that consistent mix for the rest of your painting, you can mix up quite a lot in these wells and have it for the rest of your painting. So let's put this brush cleaner to use and let's start our painting. For my watercolor landscape today, I'm going to be using square format, but you can use any format you have. You can do this landscape, you can do this portrait, and you can just adjust this sketch and either spread out your elements a little bit for a landscape format, or align them more closer together to fit into the portrait format. And I've done this landscape in a portrait format before, and it works just as fine. So the paper I'll use today is a 1264 Fabriano. This is 140 pounds, 300 GSM, which is a standard for watercolor paper, but this one is a more affordable version and it holds the paint just as well and produces the results that are just as good as some of the more expensive watercolor brands. So I'm just going to take one piece out. And even though they're all attached at the top to the pad, I like to rip the page out and paint directly onto that page. I feel like a lot of the times when I use heavier washes, it bleeds through the edges, around the edges and onto the other papers, so they tend to contaminate the rest of the pad, and I just like to work with one sheet. And I'm going to use some masking tape to secure this to my table, and also to make sure that the paper stays flat throughout the painting session. I'm a little lazy to stretch my paper with water beforehand, because it's recommended to do even for the heavier paper, like 140 pounds, because with larger washes it can still buckle. Though there are ways to fix it after you're done painting. What I do is that I flip the paper with the painting side down and I wet the other side, and then I just pick up excess water with paper towels, and then I place a couple of the fresh sheets of paper towels over it, and I put a lot of heavy books on top of it, and I let it dry up completely until the paper towels absorb the rest of the water. And as it's drying up, it's staying flat under the heavy press, so it helps you to flatten out the paper a little bit that way. Just make sure that you apply water on the back side, not of your painting side. Alright, so I'm gonna grab a pencil. I'm gonna use HB pencil for my sketch, and I'm gonna zoom in so you can see the lines a little bit better, because I like to go rather lightly with my sketch. I don't put in a lot of the details, just because I like to be kind of free with my painting, and as I start painting, sometimes I change my mind about details and kind of see as it goes, and I adjust my process along the way. Alright, so first thing that I like to do is to find the horizon line, and I like to place it on the lower third, following the rule of thirds. So somewhere right here, and my horizon line is usually the area where the mountain meets the land or mountain meets the water. So the horizon line could be higher actually, but I like to treat it as the line where there's some clear separation in my landscape. So it's not a complete horizon line, it's kind of a guideline for me. So I want to place a lake in here, sort of at the corner. And in the front here, we're gonna have a hill. So just to make this line a little bit more natural, I'm gonna sort of carve into it a little bit on both sides so it's not completely flat. You can bring in the shoreline in a little bit in some areas, and then we can erase the other line. Alright, so I'm gonna place two main mountain structures. One that's gonna be sort of in the back, and it's gonna be a lot bigger, and it will be blocking out some light for us. So here's one, and there's one right next to it, kind of more in the back. The light is going to be behind this mountain, coming from the right side, so some of the tips of this mountain will pick up some of that sunlight. On the left side, we're gonna have another mountain that is sitting slightly closer to us. And the beautiful thing about mountain is that you can use it as a design element and pretty much give any shape to it that you want and whatever fits your composition. So I like to improvise with a different shape, and here we're gonna have another kind of rocky structure in there in the front. And I will throw in another grass hill in here too, so that we have an interesting edge to all of our elements. I don't like to put in very kind of curvy slopes. There's gonna be a tree line of the evergreens right around this water line here and under our rocky structure there. We'll also put some trees on this hill too. I would also like to put some smaller trees around the water, kind of down from this hill in the foreground. We're going to elevate it a little bit by placing smaller trees down there, kind of peeking around the edge there. And it's going to be a snowy scene. So I'm gonna place kind of patches of snow onto this larger close-up mountain. And we're gonna be having more snow kind of towards the bottom, and at the top it would start kind of turning into patches there. And another important element is going to be a tree. I'm gonna place our evergreen into the foreground here. So I don't like to sketch really my evergreens too much. I kind of go with the flow as I start painting them. I kind of map out the height, how far I want the branches to stretch, but other than that, you know, it doesn't really matter. We can again just improvise with that as well. And I want to put some rocks in the foreground here, since we have rocky mountains in the back, so we can kind of bring that element closer to us and place it on the foreground here. And again, with rocks, kind of mapping out the shapes, and we're gonna do the rest of the work with color. Alright, so I think we are ready to begin. I'm gonna be using brush size 8. This is a round brush with a pointy tip that I like to use for details. I'm also gonna be using at some point a round brush size 4, but feel free to use whatever the sizes are more comfortable for you. All right, all right, so I zoomed out a little bit just so you can see better all of the colors that I'm gonna be mixing. And I'm going to start with the sky, then the background mountains, and work my way down. That's usually kind of sets the atmosphere for the entire composition and kind of sets the color tone for all of our color mixing. So the sunset is rather late, and it's not really that bright and vibrant color. I like it to be softer, so I actually like to use Naples yellow for my sunset colors. But I like to water it down just so I don't have really that intense opaque color. And I want to have a transition in my sky, so I'm actually going to pre-mix another little puddle here where I'm gonna add a little bit of alizarin crimson and a little bit of quinacridone red. We're gonna have that transitional pinkish color. And another reason why that is important is because at the kind of the end of the sky, I will put a little bit of ultramarine blue to give it the light blue tint. And when you have a yellow next to the blue, you risk turning it into green. When you have orange next to the blue, you risk turning it into a muddy color. So that's why I like to have a little bit of a pink tone in that transition, because pink and blue make a really nice purple, so you don't risk making either muddy mixes or unexpected greens, even though Naples yellow is actually pretty good when mixing with other colors. It doesn't really give those intense mixes. So I'm jumping right in with my Naples yellow into the sky, and I like to have a little bit of texture in there. So you see I'm not smoothing out, I'm leaving out puddles of paint in there. This is what I'm starting to introduce a little bit of this color where I added alizarin crimson and quinacridone red. So it's starting to darken our sky a little bit. And I'm also going to clean my brush, dry it a little bit, and I'm gonna drag this over the top of our mountains here, because they are gonna have kind of that illumination from the sunset around the edge. Make sure that I bring it over there. Now we can switch to a little bit more of the quinacridone red around our edge here. I'm going very lightly with the pigment. I don't want to have a very heavy mix because it's just the sky. And now we can pick up some watered down ultramarine blue and drop it around the edge there. And you can bring it over the area where you had some of the pink color there and make a little bit of a purple in that transition. Right now we're moving on to the mountains, and I'm gonna keep using my alizarin crimson. Once I introduce a certain main colors like reds or blues, I like to stick with them for the rest of the painting because they continue making your more harmonious mixes, making sure that the rest of the painting kind of fits with your color palette. So I'm gonna stick with the ultramarine blue for the rest of this painting. And I made a very watered down kind of lavender shade purple for the mountain that is in the back. We can give it a slightly more bluish tone towards the bottom here, because this kind of picks up a little bit less of that illumination from the sky. And we have one more, that mountain farther away in the distance. I am not putting down any of the details yet. This is just our preliminary wash. We're gonna put the rest of the details later on. Also, since we started working with this more of a bluish ultramarine color, I'm gonna still add a little bit of our purple mix that we used with the quinacridone red. And remember about the snow that I was putting down of this closer mountain here, and also there was a little bit of the snow on this rocky patch closer to us as well. So I'm gonna use some of this color and I'm gonna drop it into the snow here. I like to start painting with the lighter colors because you can always go over them with darker tones once you start adding like mountain details and the rest of the stuff. So if you decide to make any edges changes, that's always easier to do that. I'm also gonna drop a little bit of the snow here towards the edge of the water and on that mountain, that rocky structure down there as well. All right, next thing we can do is the water, the lake. So I like those really turquoise tones in the water, and starting with ultramarine blue, since we already chose it as our blue, I'm gonna give it a little bit of yellow, just a touch. So we're not turning it into green, just turquoise. I'm gonna give it a little bit of Sennelier yellow. And we're gonna start with a lighter tone farther away from us. And we're gonna slowly darken it as we bring this closer. So I'm gonna slowly start using some more of the ultramarine blue. And in the area closest to us, I'm actually gonna add some indigo to give that nice deep blue color. kind of dropping in a couple of lines in there as well, just to give some texture to the body of the water there. Okay, I'm working with small areas at a time and with small washes, so this is actually allowing me to work a little bit faster because it's drying up much faster, and especially in the areas where I want to keep my lines sharp. I want to have like the clear separation between the different details, so that is very important for me. And if you're working with larger washes, then you have to make sure that your areas are drying up before you move on to adding more details. For example, now I want to go around these edges of the mountains that I told you are going to be picking up some of the sunlight from the sunset. We're going to develop them a little bit more, kind of add the separation from the sky. So we have our orange here that we mixed from Naples yellow and quinacridone red, and I'm just gonna lightly, again, just very suggestive elements, not putting too many details there, just to suggest that little bit of warmth from the setting sun that we can't see, but we get the idea because of these edges of the mountains there. And I'm actually going to lift up a little bit of the paint if we have an excess. You just dry your brush and lightly touch the paint where you have some extra moisture in there, and also the rest of the mountain is dry too. So now I'm gonna go back to my same mix that I had for the mountain, and I use ultramarine blue and quinacridone red. And now, again, without overthinking it, without adding too much detail, I'm gonna kind of start adding texture to this mountain, kind of imagining that rocky side and some cliffs in there. We can actually make kind of a variety of tones in here as well. I can pick up a little bit more of the ultramarine blue, and some of the areas will be a little cooler than the rest. We're keeping it very light because that is still background, so we want to preserve all of the darker tones for the foreground and the middle ground. So just to make sure that we don't overdo it. Alright, now we can go down a little bit more to the rest of our kind of middle ground, and we can finish up this rocky area and also this mountain in front, because some of the colors will be similar. So there is one interesting color that I really like to use, and it's called Maroon Perylene. It's this very deep red that's sort of a little bit desaturated, and the way that I like to use it is mixing it with other colors like ultramarine blue, and it gives this really nice desaturated purple that is great to use for rocks, for shadows. And I'm going to premix a couple of mixes where one has a little bit more of the blue in it. So I have my red, more reddish here. I have mixed with the ultramarine blue, and one with a little bit more of the ultramarine blue in there. So for my side in the shadow here, it's kind of not getting too much sunlight, this rocky structure, I'm gonna use a mix of these two shades that I made. One was a little more blue. I'm kind of painting around the snow that I've placed there to create this pattern with the snow kind of covering that area. And again, we're just suggestive with our strokes, just adding some details here and there. And this is slowly going to transition into this middle ground mountain here. So we place some snow on that mountain as well. And I'm just going to start with putting some kind of holes in that snow. So we have kind of a more interesting design. And the bottom of this mountain is going to be in the shadow. And as it goes higher, it kind of starts picking up some of the sunlight coming from behind these mountains. So the color itself is also going to start getting warmer. And that's when I'm going to start switching to more of this maroon perylene color. So as we start going up the slope here, again, that's why it was easier for me to paint the snow first, because now I can kind of create more textured edge. I can cut into that snow a little bit if I need to. And towards the top, I'm actually gonna even add a little bit more of this orange that we used for the sunlit parts of the mountain there, to give it even more warmth towards the top. And here's where I'm gonna be placing my evergreen, so I'm just being a little bit careful not to overdo it on the edge here, so I have some of the clean area for the greens there. I'm just gonna blend these two colors together with a damp brush. To make sure I have a nice soft transition. Alright. Now, as that mountain is drying, we can start preparing more of this middle ground here. So I want to place a little bit more kind of a sandy beach area right here. So we're going to reuse some of our maroon perylene. We're going to mix it with the orange that we had from Naples Yellow and Quinacridone Red. And I'm going to use some of this color just along the edge here. I can also give it a little bit of a purple if I feel like this color is coming out a little too oversaturated. Purple is going to tone it down. Oops, I went over the edge a little too far. I'm gonna drag it up the mountain a little bit. Alright, we can also add our evergreens up here. So I'm gonna use my mix of ultramarine blue and indigo here that we use for the water. And I'm just gonna give it a touch of the Naples yellow. actually need more of the ultramarine blue in there. Slightly more of indigo. We want this area to be quite desaturated because it's farther away from us. So that's why I'm using Naples yellow in this mix and not like warmer reds like cadmium red, Sennelier red, because I like to keep it on the cooler side. And the way that I paint the evergreens is fairly simple, especially the ones in the background. So I just put the tree trunks first, and then I dress it up a little bit with the wiggly lines, not really painting every single branch and every single detail. I'm just varying the intensity of the color in some areas, so to kind of add more definition where some of the trees are a little lighter, some are a little darker. You can pop a couple of dots in the back to just suggest some tips out there in the back. We're still gonna add a little bit of the grass in the front. And we can also do the same thing in the foreground here. If you remember, I want to place some of the trees there as well. And these are going to be actually in the shadow even more. So I'm going to use even more of the indigo in this same mix. And the same way, just very kind of suggestive shapes. And remember to vary the height of your trees, and also vary the spaces in between them, so they don't turn out looking like all the exact same clones of each other. And this area down there is all in the shadow. So that's why I'm keeping these trees just as sort of silhouettes. Alright, now while that is drying, we can work on the rest of the main elements on the foreground. So I want to start working on the tree here in front, because to finish up the mountain here, the rest of it, I need to see the placement of my tree there. So I'm gonna start with making a warm color for the top where it's picking up some of the sunlight as well. So I'm gonna start with some ultramarine blue, some Sennelier yellow, and gamboge. This makes a very nice olive green kind of color. So again, I'm starting with the top, and this warmer color is mainly going to be on the right side. That's where the sun is coming from. but we also have a three-dimensional tree, so their branch is going to be extending forward towards us as well. So we have to remember to give them some sunshine here as well too. And we can also pop even a little bit of the burnt sienna in some of the areas for even more warmer look. And as I go towards the bottom, I'm gonna start losing some of that sunlight. So I'm gonna slowly start transitioning more towards my green color. And I like to paint with leaving some of the paint kind of collecting in puddles. It continues to mix as it dries, and especially some of the granulating beautiful colors too. That adds a very nice texture. So, and as I continue going down, I'm gonna add even a little bit more of the ultramarine blue. Into this mix. I'm gonna have a slightly more cooler tone, which is still sort of this mid-tone highlight. I am going to be adding shadows later on. So we are still kind of working with just a highlight tone. Highlight to mid-tone, because this tree is pretty dark by nature, so we don't really have that much of the separation between the highlight and the shadow value. So it's gonna look very weird, it's gonna look very crooked. What I painted is just the highlights for the tree. So I just imagine the branches that would be picking up some light. And as I add the other side, the shadows later, once this is dry, it's gonna make a lot more sense. But in the meantime, while this is drying, we can continue working on the middle ground here. So I'm gonna give it a little bit of the grassy area, kind of again reusing all of the greens that we already have. It just makes a more natural that way when you kind of keep the same colors for your environment. Throwing in a little bit of grass there. Now the slope over here towards the left, I'm gonna give it a little bit of a variety of tones. It is gonna be all grassy, but as it's drying, I'm gonna be jumping between some orange and some darker colors so that we have a nice texture going on in there. And I'm gonna drop some of the grass towards the water, and I'm gonna pick up some of the orange tones here. I'm gonna pick up some of the blue tones here as well. Again, some of the orange in there too. Maybe there's some patches. Alright, another thing that we can do is also give a little bit more definition to this mountain in the middle ground. So again, using the same colors, I use maroon perylene and I use ultramarine blue. That's a little too much, the ultramarine blue. And by the way, I'm already noticing how nice it feels to clean the brush in this brush holder, because you can just watch me rub my brush on those ripples on the bottom and all of the paint comes off right away, and then I just dip it into the cleaner water to make sure it's all clean. So very happy with it. Alright, so we're picking up a little bit more of the color here, and just to again give it more definition, because now this mountain is closer to us, so we're gonna see even more detail, also kind of more separation between highlights, shadows, and midtones. Again, not following any references here, it's all very suggestive, it's all kind of very intuitive, and it's how I like to paint landscapes, because it's very relaxing for me, and it kind of that sweet escape to where you're not really forced to follow any references. You can just make believable images that might be completely imagined, but as long as you just follow the rule of the perspective, the aerial perspective, where things in the background are more faded away, in the foreground they have more contrast, more saturation, anything you paint is going to be believable, and it's going to convince your viewers that, you know, maybe this is real. Maybe somewhere it actually does exist. And I'm actually going to paint the other side of this mountain with more of this bluish mix that we made with our maroon perylene, because this is going to be all in the shadow there. I'm kind of painting around my tree, but you know, if I touch it, if it bleeds a little bit, I don't mind. We're still gonna define that edge of the tree with the shadows, so that's no big deal. Just add some extra pop of green in there. Alright, now we can start working more on the foreground too. So the foreground is going to be a grassy area and with some rocks in here, but it's also mainly in the shadow now. So we don't have as much sunlight anymore like we had at the top of the tree. And I'm just going to be reusing the same colors. So we have our ultramarine blue. I'm going to give it a little bit of Sennelier yellow for the greens, and even though this is mainly grassy area, it still looks nice when you have a variety of tones in it. So I'm still going to be popping some of the oranges that we have saved in here, maybe some of the darker blues again for some shadows. So it's sort of a similar way that we painted that hill in the middle ground. You can also drop even a little bit of the burnt sienna in there. For even more intense browns. Just remixing the same color for just slightly higher intensity. Make sure I have enough pigment here. You can also throw some of the Naples yellow in that mix as well. It's just going to desaturate the greens. It's not gonna make it too warm. You can throw some of the indigo mix in there too. Since this is now the foreground, we can really get playful with the details here. You know, it's all only working to our advantage of separating the foreground from the background. So that's why I have kind of a lot of these funky areas going on here. Really trying to add a lot of the information in here, even though it's all just grass and some soil, some rocks. Okay, so I kind of left out some areas for the rocks in there. We can paint them once this is fairly dry, so it doesn't all bleed into the grass, because again, this is foreground, so we kind of have clear separation between the different areas and different tones. Alright, now that my trees is actually dry, we can paint the shadow side of it. So I'm gonna use my indigo. You can use some Payne's gray and some blue added to it. So like Payne's gray with ultramarine blue, or Payne's gray with phthalo blue. And I'm gonna give it just a dash, kind of this leftover green, to green it up a little bit, so it's not a total blue indigo, so it does have a tiny bit of suggestion of green. And again, starting from the top, remember that the shadows, just like the highlights, are not going to be limited just to the left side. We are going to have some areas of overlapping branches even in the highlighted area, so popping some of the shadows in there is again just going to add to that sense of the realism a little bit. Like especially going like under the branches a little bit. And just making sure that you have enough variety. You don't have to make like every next branch extending farther than previous. You can kind of play around and cut some of them a little bit short. Yeah, we're painting sort of a wild nature. These are not perfectly trimmed and cultivated trees, so they do tend to have kind of a more of an imperfect look. That sort of a wabi-sabi effect. Just making sure I have enough of intensity in my darks here, because this again is the foreground, so we want to make sure we kind of do the justice to the right values and, you know, putting in the right intensity of the shadows. We can use a little bit of the burnt umber just on its own and just kind of suggest the trunk in there. Just a couple of dots in some areas, you know, it doesn't have to be a full stick going all the way down. Alright, now that the grass is dry in the foreground here, we can also add the rest of our rocks. And reusing the same colors that we've already used for the rocks, I'm using maroon perylene. I'm adding some ultramarine blue to make this kind of toned down purple. And I'm using some more ultramarine blue and another mix here to have even more intense and much cooler blue for the shadows there. Shadows on the rocks. So I'm gonna start with the kind of lighter highlighted tones, and I'm gonna variate between different warmer and cooler colors here and there, because the rocks come in all the different shapes and colors. And while that is drying, we can add some evergreens to this little hill. Again, just suggestive strokes. They don't even really have to be just evergreens either. It can be just anything. Again, we also add a little bit more definition and just a little bit more depth with some extra shadows into this tree line. We can also even pop some of them up there. I mean, who's gonna stop us, right? We can grow trees anywhere we want. Just remember to keep them smaller as they go farther away. Okay, now that the foreground rocks are dry, we can go in with now even more, with a little indigo dropped in there for even more intense shadows. And just kind of trying to see some of the shapes in, like, in all of these random blobs that we put there. Like, I don't follow any references for rocks. I just You know, it's like finding shapes in the clouds. You just kind of look at them and see, all right, what is this shape? Do we put it in the shadow? Do we leave it out in front? Do we cut through this area and kind of separate the rocks there? And now we can have kind of some creases in there and some cracks. And it's that easy. Doesn't have to be anything overly complicated. Alright, well, that is drying. Before I add some just couple of finishing touches to the foreground grass area, I just want to finish a little bit of the definition on this mountain, like on the shadow side of this mountain. So I'm just gonna pick up some ultramarine blue into our maroon perylene mix, just so it's not like complete blue, so it has a little bit of a toned down purple in there. And the similar way that we work on this mountain in here, we can just kind of dress it up in all the random ways. Make sure that your evergreen is dry by this point. If not, maybe hold on for a second. We can add actually some extra blue in here too. And I actually also want to use just a little bit for the shadows there. A little bit of the ultramarine blue on its own. Just to give a couple of shadows to these snowy areas, especially when they're sitting kind of right under those rocky structures that are supposed to cast some some shadow onto them. And also we can drop a little bit more shadow in here, since again all of this snow, all of this mountain is in the shadow too. Alright, and we can finish up the foreground. So I'm just gonna pick up some of our indigo that we have here. Actually, let's give it a little bit more of a green tone. I'm gonna drop some of the Sennelier yellow in there. And I'm just gonna flick my brush. And remember how I told you I'm gonna use two different sizes? And well, here I am, using the same brush for all of it. Well, last cleaning at the end, right? So you can switch to a smaller brush if you want to, but again, I'm not doing anything that's overly complicated here. I'm just flicking my brush like here and there, especially closer to the foreground here to kind of suggest some weeds in there and suggest some texture. You can also do some dry brush effect to suggest some grass. You know, our eyes are actually gonna complete the look, and you don't really need to paint every single thing, because once the viewer looks at it, you know, they're gonna know right away that this is grass, this is some sort of vegetation in there. And again, as we go kind of farther away, I'm just Gonna make my strokes smaller and a lot more suggestive again. So I'm just maybe like putting some shapes in there. You can also put a little bit of a darker shadow under the tree on this side. It's gonna be letting even less of the light showing through there. And we just kind of go back at this point and see if anything else needs any details. You know, any last touches there. Maybe some more details on the water here. And I want to just do one last thing. Just with a little bit of ultramarine blue and with this kind of indigo and Sennelier yellow mix. I want to suggest a couple more of the evergreens that would kind of be sort of back there in the background. So they're a lot more faded and not necessarily as detailed. We're gonna push them more into the background. But just so our tree is not standing there alone, we're gonna drop some trees in there. And this is it for our dreamy landscape. So now my favorite part, removing the masking tape. And here is our finished landscape. I like the way that all the details turned out and how all the colors are looking together. And I also greatly enjoy using my new brush cleaner. You see how much of the color I was able to get off of the brush, so that the other container, when I was picking up some of the clean water for my mixing, this stayed clean. And this is what makes sure that all of your mixes on your palette are also stay clean and true to what color you're going after, so you're not contaminating with all the extra residue coming off of your brush. And also it has an extra holder for my other brushes. I was just kind of testing out how big of a brush I can put in there, and even my quill brush fits in there nicely. Another idea that I had for this is that if you take your brushes out and you take this organizer out, you can actually stack your cotton rags or paper towels in there. And you've seen me a lot dabbing my brush onto those rags to dry it off, but you can actually use these rugs in here to just dab it on there to make sure that none of this paint bleeds through the rags and onto your desk. So it's all gonna stay in there, and it's easy to just wiggle your brush in there, dry it up, and make sure that you're ready to continue painting. And I want to thank everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I want to thank Gamenote for sending this wonderful brush cleaner. You're gonna see it more in the upcoming videos, as I'm gonna be using this now for all of my paintings. And I hope you had a chance to paint along. If you did, tag me on the social media. You're gonna see all of my tags in the description below. Let me know how it went. If you have any other questions or if you ran into any problems, just leave it in the comments below and I will get back to you. I always love seeing your creations after my tutorials, and I'll give you a shout out on my social media. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you gave it a try. And I hope you leave it a like. I hope you subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!